What's up, guys? Your agent Tyler Wayrung here with Keller Williams, and today we're going to talk about the costs of selling a home. We get asked the question a lot of what does it actually cost to list my home, to sell my home, and what are all the costs associated? And so we have kind of two different approaches to think about this. So we'll talk about that and everything that should go into it and how you should start to think through that process. So with that, let's jump in. All right, so we get asked the question a lot. What does it cost to sell my house? And what I think most of the time what people are after is if I sell my house for X, what is the Y that's going to be left over at the end that I actually get to keep and put in my pocket? I think everyone knows that there are costs associated. So if you sell your house for $100,000, you're not going to leave the closing table with a check for $100,000 in most cases. So kind of what are all those costs associated? How do I account for them? Plan for them and factor all that in when I'm coming up with the list price and planning for what I'm going to do after I sell the home with a certain amount of money. How much can I then put into another property or into another venture? So we like to think about this in two separate ways. There's the first piece, which is really the transactional piece and the costs associated with the transaction that I think most people are focused on, and rightfully so. But there is a second piece as well that's all the associated costs with actually putting the house on the market, getting it ready to put on the market, and then actually moving into another property. And so if you go out and do your research online, we did two quick Google searches on what does it actually cost to sell my home. Bankrate and nerdwallet.com, two very respectable resources out there in the market, are quoting around 10% of gross sales price, which means if you sell for $100,000, 10% of that would be $10,000 is what it would cost to sell your home. Now they're factoring in kind of both cases like we talked about before, costs specifically associated with the transaction and costs associated with getting the house ready and moving into that next property. So I'd like to break the two apart and talk about them separately, and hopefully that helps you kind of think through them. So let's go first, we'll talk about costs specifically associated with the transaction. Okay, so these are costs that you won't see directly until at closing day. They'll show up on the HUD settlement statement and you'll see where everything comes out. All right, so the biggest expense here, and I think what a lot of people are often asking when they're asking, what does it cost to sell my house, is the real estate commissions. What are real estate commissions? How much should I expect to pay you? And how do I factor that in? So there are many different ways you can structure a commission, but I'll speak for the kind of majority, the way that typically people buy and sell houses on the MLS, and that's to account for 6% of the gross sales price going out in real estate commissions. Now, so if we sell a $100,000 house, that's $6,000 in real estate commission. And if we think about that, we often talk to people and say, man, I'm paying you $6,000, to do that. Well, it's a little bit different than that. So the actual listing broker and the buyer's broker are each splitting that in half. And now keep in mind, guys, I'm talking about the most traditional cases. There are lots of ways to structure these, but for most cases, each side is going to keep 3% of that 6%. They'll kind of split that out in the two. All right, and then most real estate agents don't get to keep all of that 3%. Most of them are splitting that 3% with their broker in some kind of split. Everybody has a different one there. So just calling all that out so you know that that $6,000 check isn't going straight in your real estate agent's pocket and he's not taking his family out to dinner with that. It's likely a much smaller sliver of that whole pie, and it's going to both the buyer and seller's agent, but that is a cost typically associated with selling the home. The seller pays for that. So if you remember, if we go back to that 10% that these other sources are quoting, 6% of that is tied up in commission. So that's the largest chunk, but the next biggest chunk there is closing costs. And this is where it starts to get a little hard to determine because most things from here can be negotiated and aren't always the responsibility of the seller. Now, for the most cases in a seller's market, the buyers are typically paying for closing costs because that is a more incentive for the seller to pick their offer when there are multiple on the table. But in a buyer's market, it's just the opposite. A seller is more willing to accommodate a buyer if they're willing to buy the home, so they might look to cover closing costs. So on average, these are around 1 to 2% of the gross sales price, and you can structure it any way. This can be negotiated. You can negotiate up to a specific dollar amount. It doesn't always have to be a percentage, but just looking at it, all the sources out there, they say roughly plan for 1 to 2% of the sales price. So if we go back to that first number, we're at 6. We had another 1 to 2 there. We're at 7 or 8. And then from there, the other miscellaneous couple percent can come from various different areas, such as tax prorations, things like HOA dues. Now, most of the time, these are paid in arrears, which means advance. So depending on when you pay these, you might actually get a credit at closing. If you just paid your bill for the whole next year and you sell your house the next month, you're going to get a credit for those months that you paid. But then the opposite is true. If your tax bill is due next month and you sell this month, you're likely going to owe more. So you'll see likely a debit there on the HUD settlement statement. But there are lots of miscellaneous things that can happen in this other 1%. Now let's shift over to those non-transactional costs that Bankrate and NerdWallet and some of the other sources out there will include in this global 10% that you should expect to pay in sales costs. Some of these things are the costs associated with getting the house ready to sell and then actually moving into a new house. These are things like make-ready expenses. Most people have things in their house that just aren't working correctly or might need repaired that they've been living comfortable with. But now that it's time to put it on the market, you want to be as turnkey as possible. So you want to get things like maybe the dishwasher fixed or the back doorknob on your handle doesn't lock correctly. Things like this you want to get fixed. So these costs kind of all add up to get the house in condition where it's ready to list. Maybe you're going to paint or put new flooring in. All these costs are kind of factored in when they came up with this number. These are also things like moving expenses into your new property. Things like actually hiring a moving company, hiring a U-Haul, or getting boxes and packed up and ready to do that. So you can see there where things start to nickel and dime and add up when you put these together. They've also factored in the percent of sellers who actually pay to have the home staged. Now this can be anywhere from a couple $100s to a couple thousand, depending on the area and how big the home is, what the condition it is, etc. So lastly, they've also factored in something that we're starting to see more often now that it is a seller's market, but some folks are actually prepaying for an inspection on the home prior to listing it, so they're able to identify where the major areas are in advance and potentially go ahead and fix them or let the buyers know ahead of time, these are the things that are wrong that I'm not going to fix, and so you can't come back later and ask me to fix them after you've gotten your inspection. So it's kind of a way to just clear out any potential hiccups that come down the road. A lot of buyers like to put a property under contract, get it inspected, and then renegotiate a bunch of things based on that inspection. So a lot of sellers today are kind of taking care of that in advance and taking that option away from the buyer. And so all that kind of rolls up into that global 10% that these other sources are quoting. All right. So I hope that was helpful, and to really think about it in two fundamental ways: the transactional costs and then the other associated costs that all roll up together. And there's been a lot of research that's gone into this, so you really should factor in both costs associated, especially if you're moving into a new home, because those costs will add up and you should factor all that in so you're not caught off guard. It's always not a bad idea to go ahead and be conservative and plan on 10% and hope you can dial that down and you'll end up better off in the long run. But I hope this was helpful, guys, and at least give you some information on what to expect when you're just thinking about listing your home and what you should expect to walk away from the closing table with based on a particular sales price. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. I will try to answer every comment out there. And always, if you know somebody who is just getting ready to start this process and this video might help them, always would appreciate a share with them on that. I'd be forever grateful. But with that, I'm Tyler Wayrung, and we'll catch you next time.